Mon cher Pierre, la
Well, Pierre, that's a hard act to follow. Let's build the culture of hope. That's what I've understood, and it's up to you to preside over discussion on countercultures with a great deal of hope, I hope. Your past justifies your position here. You have been referred to as somebody who's written the best possible report on these questions that has ever been drafted, and that report is gathering dust in a drawer somewhere. You have been an amateur of music, the music of the time, but you also like older music. You were at the head of a TV channel without which French movie making would not be what it is today. Today you are governing a theater. And on the culture of hope, let me hand the chair over to you and introduce your panelists. Thank you very much, Nicolas. Around me I have an artist, a poet, somebody who's responsible for a cultural institute, and a composer who is a very contemporary composer. And it's a debate which I think is very timely at the end of today when we've talked about the power of culture, we've talked about cultural policies, and now the question is, where are the countercultures? You need culture and counterculture. If you have power, you need the opposing power. If you have culture, you need counterculture. But it's a little complicated. Snow White, if I can call her that, but I loved Nicolas Seydoux' presentation of her as Snow White. She talked about a great debate. And I think we're searching this afternoon. I don't know whether it's going to be a big search, but I think it's perhaps a little early in the digital revolution and in the revolution of cultural practices that we're witnessing at the moment, where everything is happening at the same time. It's perhaps a little premature to witness the emergence of countercultures, because very much countercultures very need an established order to emerge as countercultures. Let me talk about our panelists. Pascal Dussapin, you are a composer of contemporary music, a major composer. Your works are played throughout Europe and throughout the world, and you are always very interested and have always very interested in how contemporary music is organized and expressed in public. With you around this table, Marco Bambe. Can I call you Captain? You're a slammer, and it's interesting because slam a few years ago was almost counterculture. Now you're very much in the established culture. James Davis is one of the major players of Google's Cultural Institute. And Google's Cultural Institute embraces a whole series of issues. It's fairly revolutionary, the Google Art Project. You're working with Amit Sood, who is the founder, and it will be interesting to hear what you have to say. Next to me, Jasmina Sibic, who is a plastic artist, a sculptor from Slovenia. Slovenia is very well represented here in the 2013 edition of the Forum because we had the Slovenian Minister of Culture earlier on. Not only did he say some things, he said some very interesting and significant things. Serge Schick, you will be presenting to us something which is very interesting at the end of this debate, which is a study carried out by EINA. You're a contributor and a major player in INA. And you've carried out a study about how buzz arises on the net. Buzz has become something that's passed into our language, and how cultural buzz is created. But let's start with a study. And we need studies because people have talked about my studies and reports, and I've done quite a few of these reports over the past few years. And the study that we're going to hear about today, like many which have been presented at the Forum over the past few years, and particularly this year, all studies are interesting, and your study, I think, does give us a greater comprehension of digital practices. And your study is called The Era of Prescription, From Abundance to Discovery. Laurent Colombani, you're a partner of Bain & Company. You've been coming to this forum for the past 5 years, and the Bain studies have been one of the main contributors to the Avignon Forum. And you created with Bain, Laurent, an observatory of digital cultural practices in 8 countries. You asked people, 6,000 people from France, the UK, the US, Germany, Russia, China, Brazil, and India. So thanks very much for that work. I think everyone's going to say thanks to you, and everyone's going to keep your study very preciously. And to start this roundtable on the curation, the prescription of culture and counterculture, let me ask you this question. In the digital ecosystem, who today, as you see it and as the consumers see it, who has the power to curate? Thank you very much indeed. Yes, this year we have looked at the emergence of algorithms and the social networks as curators to recommend works and have an impact on the whole of the cultural ecosystem. Where does this all start? Where it really does all start, and which is why we're raising the question of algorithms and social networks, and I shall say this very quickly, because we have all witnessed the tremendous increase in the number of connected devices. And these are personal cultural devices. And there is a major obligation here, and this is something we've seen all over the world, and that's why we carried out this study all over the world, because there are some very considerable implications. The first is that we are moving away from households to individuals. And individuals choose their culture. It used to be a group, a household that chose to see a film, to listen to a piece of music, and there was always a group decision. It's no longer a group decision. It's no longer people who are with you and around you. It's a virtual community, people with whom you share the same interests. They may be your friends. They may be people you don't know at all, but they share a number of interests with you. And that is a fundamental change in the way in which we curate works. Second thing, which is extremely strategic in this change in prescription and curation, is that we have moved away from physical cultural objects, limited in space and time, to dematerialized infinite cultural goods. And an infinity of choices is no choice. So the question is, who is going to help you to choose? Who is going to tell you what you're interested in? Who is going to tell you what you can discover? That's very interesting now. And in this and the final point is that in this notion of dematerialization, we have now moved away from buying something to buying a service. So people don't buy a CD anymore. They subscribe to a music service, which gives them access to music. And those access services are going to have a vital role to play in the future of culture. So who holds the recommendations? The digital platforms. Monsieur Toubon talked about digital platforms. Those digital platforms are becoming strategic in cultural choices. When you ask consumers today, where are you going to find the culture you listen to? These large, huge international digital platforms are cited more often than once, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon countries. They have become the supermarkets of culture. But we're also seeing more independent players emerging, specialized players in music, for instance. So we see that the independent players are playing a role. Netflix, Spotify in music. They are too becoming major curators of culture in all its forms. We've never had so much choice, have we? And yet, as you've said, when there is too much choice, there's no choice. What about the desire of culture? Can that desire be manipulated? Yes. The first thing we are focusing on after seeing who the new players are in curating cultural content is who influences people. And what influences people? We've tried to measure that in three major parameters. The machine, the algorithm. We've all used machines which propose recommendations on the basis of what you've listened to before. Social networks, who are my friends listening to, who are my friends reading, and the traditional curators, the critics, the literary and music critics, the programmers, and so on and so forth. And it's very interesting to see over time how these things have evolved over the past 3 years. There's been a tremendous increase in algorithms and social networks to the detriment of the professionals and professional critics. They're tending to lose influence. Films, videos, television series, serials, social networks and algorithms are considered to be one of the major curators, so that puts them at about the same level as professional critics. It's the same in music. If you ask the same question of consumers, they'll say that algorithms and social networks are increasing, and critics and professionals are no longer as influential as they were just 3 years ago. And when you ask people, not in any particular age group, but all people in the Western countries, they say that social networks are the major curator of music before the algorithms and before the before professional critics. And one final point, a focus on Western countries. It's not limited to the US, to the UK, and to Europe. When you ask this same question throughout the world, including in the emerging countries, we see the same phenomenon, the same increase in algorithms and social networks. Of course, in Asia, it's basically the case for urban and connected people, but there's not a major discrepancy. One could imagine in Brazil, for instance, that in social networks there is an advance of these new forms of curation compared to Western countries. So man has yielded to machines, and the machines are well fed and very intelligent. And on the basis of that old phrase, content is king, content is not quite as good. Content is king is not quite as good in French as it is. Is content king or are consumers kings? Well, what we were struck by when we looked at these first results is something which isn't new in cultural industries. Can there be a dictatorship of the consumer? In other words, can the consumer take power and take power over from an industry which provided the supply and which tried to generate demand? This is not a new question, and it was mentioned this morning. There was a very good cartoon with the artist who was looking for recognition, the producer looking for money, his return on investment, and the consumer looking for mediocrity. And it's a question which we've had for many years. And there are two ways of answering that question. The first is that it's nothing new. This is what you can see on the screen here. The notion of marketing, customer analysis leading to uniformization is not new. And this you can see in the American box office over the past 30 years. Original films have not done as well as series, well-known formula, and there's tend to be a disappearance of original creation. And the digital platforms are not changing that balance very radically. Looking at movie making once again, most of the downloads on iTunes are the same franchises, the same brands that are the number 1 and 2 in the box office. So there's a real danger of uniformization, yes. But that's not new. If you look, however, at it somewhat differently, and see what can change that tendency, well, the first thing that one can say is that as original creation has been disappearing from movie making, it hasn't disappeared, but it's moved elsewhere. It's moved to television, and major movie makers and projects have now tended to migrate towards the TV. And we can see them on digital platforms as well. Netflix has done a lot of original creation, which is successful both in economic terms, but also in critical appraisal. And the series that they've produced have been given prizes in several forums. We could go beyond that and say it's thanks to these digital platforms, thanks to the analysis of what consumers want, is that content, quality content, can be created. And the House of Cards, for instance, benefited from Netflix's experience of their subscriber base. They defined a product which would be the most suitable for that subscriber base. And there's an anecdote here. In the production of the House of Cards, Netflix realized that there was a work here that really met their needs. They not only financed one season, they financed 2 seasons, and they didn't even have a pilot run because that was what the producers. That was what got the producers to get into a partnership with Netflix, because it responded to consumer needs. And to conclude on that subject, we could go even further. And crowdfunding was mentioned this morning. Crowdfunding is very, very fascinating in this respect. There are more and more ambitious projects which are crowdfunded directly by consumers. So consumers are creating content and financing that content. So there isn't obviously, consumers are not going to create the content themselves, but there are very, very ambitious projects of financing works in movie making, music, video games. These are directly crowdfunded by consumers through specific platforms. As was said this morning, the average level of funding is very low, but if you look at the long tail of a number of projects in photography and things like that, there are some categories, films, video games, where we are seeing the emergence of crowdfunding adding up to 10, 20, $30 million for some video games. So, I mean, this is not the long tail by any means. And we in Bain find this very interesting because it's a real illustration of what we called the creative milieu. It's not marginal, it's not a blockbuster, it's somewhere between the two. And it shows that contents and consumers are not necessarily in opposition. But counterculture, says Pierre Lescure, has very often been the production of works that consumers weren't expecting. Your 6,000 people in your survey, are they prepared to see things or to listen to things that they weren't expecting initially? Well, that's another very interesting point. And there's no change there. There are some things which are unchanged. When you look at what consumers are looking for today, what one always finds are original content, different content. That's what they're looking for. And when you look at the changes that have occurred in the rules of the game, we are seeing new rules of the game emerging, and they're very similar to the old ones in a way. But to answer your question more directly, if you look at these new rules of the game, there are 3 of them. One of them is unchanged, and that is the differentiated and original content is the content which is going to emerge on digital platforms. To go back to what we were saying initially, the profusion of content means that original content is more necessary than ever. What is changing is the way in which that original content is now produced and emerges. When there was one single supply policy, and there are now several supply and innovation policies nourished by consumer wishes and expectations. There are platforms which use data about consumers to try and fit products to unexpressed needs. So I'm not saying that there is an opposition between editorial content and the analysis of needs. You can find, by analyzing consumer needs and expectations, hidden needs and use that to create original content, to create a new kind of work. So there is potential there, but you have to find where that potential is, and you find it in your customer base. So the algorithm will tell me what I need without me realizing it. Is that what you're saying? Well, the idea will be the algorithms will try to find out what you really want. Ah, that's a great algorithm. I'd really like to see how that works. Jasmina, James, Pascal, Captain, thank you very much indeed, Laurent, for that study. And I think we all ought to look at that study and read the tables very carefully. But the question for the four of you is this. What is the definition today, realizing that there are these new things emerging and changing all the time? What about counterculture? Where do we find the countercultures today? Let's start with Pascal Dussapin. When you create according to a well-defined method in terms of harmony, the tonal system, is it a form of counterculture, contemporary music? Is it a kind of is it counterculture? You're talking about today about a composer who starts writing tonal music. Are you saying that that's the counterculture? If that's your question, why the hell are you asking me? No, what I'm saying is you have a framework in which a form of counterculture is linked to contemporary music. There is a specificity of the structure of the contemporary music. I mean, people listen to more and more music, but more and more music is still funded basically by public funds. And you are basically one of the great definitions in contemporary music of counterculture. Yes, but listening to you previously, counterculture, and I'm not going to, I don't need to tell you this. I mean, when we talk about counterculture, we think about the Beat Generation in the 1960s and 70s in the US. That was the definition of counterculture. And I think the artists in the counterculture today are perhaps more and more people like me. That doesn't mean to say that we have been evicted from culture, even though I mustn't complain. But to answer your question more seriously, you're referring, I think, when you're talking about counterculture, to a narrative in the past. And the narrative is that music, written music, is basically a very small proportion of world music. It's a very small proportion. And one of the major characteristics of Western Christian art, this is the case in history, was concerned with systems, mediation systems. Here we're in the palace of the popes, and music resonated through these halls in centuries and centuries, subject to very slow changes, which tried to organize it. The music followed the text, and the text produced the melody, and then gradually there was music which became independent of the text, but it didn't become tonal. Tonality, Monteverdi was not a tonal musician in the Renaissance. He was a model musician. Okay, I'm not going to give you a musicological analysis, but believe me. And gradually the system changed until the beginning of the 20th century. It consolidated, it produced a theoretical system, it produced appeal. If you look at Wagner's music, for instance, it's extraordinarily appealing music, romantic music. It was designed to produce a particular emotion which arose out of the breakdown of the system. Wagner stretched the system to its limits. He chromatized it more and more. And then there was Mahler, then there was Schoenberg, and then the wars, the history of the world, the history of thought, because this wasn't exclusively musical, this type of evolution. And from then on, Contemporary 20th century thought, and I'll come back to what I mean by contemporary, is a perpetual production of countercultures because it was constantly rebelling against the system. The system tried to control everything. Schoenberg, for instance, when he started to break things down, he was at the margins of musical society. And to reintegrate the codes of the time, he had to fight for it. And he had to carry out a political battle. For reasons we know, Schoenberg then went to live in the United States, and his friends, Alban Berg and others, continued the fight. So that's not the only story of the counterculture in music. There are many other stories of music, and in the story and the history of music, particularly in the 20th century, of cultures and countercultures. There were other currents, Janacek, Sibelius, music from Eastern Europe, and then after the Second World War, there was the desire to refound everything. I don't like the word contemporary music because it's discriminatory. People don't like it. They think it's bizarre. It sounds bizarre to their ears. But the German composers after 1945, they couldn't do what musicians before them did, so they redefined the language. They were really involved in counterculture, and the counterculture there in Germany after the war, funnily enough, was funded by the CIA. Because the Americans financed contemporary music festivals so that the Germans would forget Wagner, Donaueschingen, Darmstadt, and all the rest of it. These were contemporary music festivals financed by the CIA at the time. They said, well, let's get the Germans to think about something else because, we know what Wagner led to. That's what the position was at the time. In other words, they were financing the counterculture, but nevertheless, they wanted to control everything at the same time. They wanted to lay down the law. So, to come back to your question, I think that these are all flows and counterflows with tension, magic moments, and all the rest of it. There are major works which have come out of all this over the past 50 to 60 years, written for traditional orchestras. And traditional orchestras, of course, have changed considerably in form and in substance over that time as well. And the tension there has been very interesting to observe. And it isn't only due to globalization, it's due to the fact that we've gone as far as we can with the current grammars, with the current strategies used by some works. I hope I'm making myself clear here, but when you asked me the question a few moments ago, is a contemporary musician a musician who uses tonal language? Everyone uses it today, and I'm sure that, Pascal, you didn't really mean to ask me that question as to whether that was a counterculture. It depends. It depends. That's a good answer. No, but let me qualify it a bit. Somebody who uses a common language, which is that of all music of the world, or most of the music of the world, because, of course, Chinese music is not the same. The Chinese musicians don't know what tonality is, tonal music. I'm talking about traditional music. That being said, somebody who wants to use harmonies, soothing harmonies, is going to be in line with society because that's what society likes. But as an artist, he may also want to, as I said, refuse to invent something new. Not something new, but something which is going to create new emotions. Because creating something new, that's old hat. But that musician and myself, we don't necessarily use atonal music and atonal language, or I don't anyway. He and I are going to be in a counterculture. It's no longer a question of grammar. It's a much simpler question than that. How people like me, and I'm the one who's here today, how can I exist today in the face of Lady Gaga and others? Do you think it was easier to exist when Elvis Presley was around as a composer? No, what you're saying is that you can be heard by a much larger audience than your grandfather would have been if he'd been a composer through the technologies of the time. Yeah, sure. My music or music of one of my colleagues, if it is played at midnight on France Musique in France, more people will listen to it than people listen to Mozart during his lifetime. No, but that's not the real question. Look at literature, for instance. Michaud. He didn't want to sell more than 3,000 copies of his of a book throughout his life. He didn't want to be in have a paperback edition. Beckett sold 10,000 copies of each book. So the real question is not that Michaud sold 3,000 books and didn't want to sell any more. The point is who is involved in poetry today, who knows anything about poetry, does not know Beckett or Michaud. What about Webern? Webern has sold a few thousand records. But who is interested in music can ignore Webern? Who in the serious world of music can ignore Webern? Nobody. So that's good, isn't it? Yeah, it's very good. When Mr. Colombani was talking about flows earlier on, we were talking about, and I noted this down, how can the consumer appropriate content? What's the supply side of all this? Now, Christ, if I were to ask myself that question, I would get a subscription to some internet service, ISP, and download thousands of gigabytes. No, what I'm saying is that it's not necessarily the flows and the networks which are important. They're not the only ones which determine our worldview and what we listen to and what we see. Thank you. Poet and slammer. Mac, you were here last year with Fabrice Di Falco, a countertenor who was very moving. I think he's here today, isn't he? Yes, he is here. I greet him if he's in this conclave. Slam, as I said earlier on, just to get you to react by a first question, slam was a kind of counterculture which came after rap a few years ago, and now you're more or less in the mainstream, aren't you? Well, we've moved away from the margins, yes, and a lot of slammers have become the mainstream, yeah. It's taught in lycées and schools and universities. Some of my texts apparently are studied for the baccalaureate, so we've become into the mainstream. But it's also a protest movement because there are artists who bring out CDs, who bring out texts, and we know who they are. But there is an international movement over and above that. We've met people of that kind from Senegal, from Cuba to South Africa. There is a movement of slam which has remained a protest movement, quite apart from the slammers who sell a lot of records and who agree to be part of the system. And because they are part of the system, they get more money. Okay, but there is still that movement out there which remains very vibrant. So what advice would, what definition would you give of counterculture in general? My definition when I was young in the 1960s and 70s was, okay, I know what it was, but what's your definition of counterculture today? I think anywhere where you can create resistance to the world in which we all live, and with which we all have to make concessions. So I think anything which makes it possible to have moments of the absurd, that's a definition of counterculture. Resistance. And slam is part of the resistance movement, But I was talking about Senegal a few moments ago. I was there a few weeks ago. There is an association of slams and rappers who brought a president down. So it is still a protest movement. The slammers brought the president down and had a new president elected. So our writing, our music is a protest against oppression. And it is young people who actually demonstrated, who told their texts and who read those texts to people who couldn't read. They mobilized a whole lot of people. And it's something that the protest movement has done over the past few years. And it's really great that it's done that. Has the digital revolution helped you to do that? Sure, sure. While we in the West were sharing our lives on Facebook, over there they were actually doing something. They were meeting each other. It was a bit like the Arab Spring. They were saying to each other, let's go and demonstrate. Let's go and demonstrate for change. Let's go and have an impact on the political debate. And let's show the president who wanted to run for election again at a time when he should really have left the scene. They wanted to get rid of him, and they got rid of him. And the young people met thanks to the social networks. They diffused information over the social networks, and that's protest. And aesthetics became ethics. And that's basically what counterculture is all about. Yes, because the social networks, like all the digital instruments, broadcast something which has a tremendous resonance. It's the printing press with tremendous resonance. I mean, you can always say no, but it's in press, but it's printed, and now it's being sung. So counterculture has gained something with the digital technologies. Yes, indeed. If you use those digital technologies properly, and if you don't get overwhelmed by it, let's not forget the purpose of all this. The purpose of everything, the purpose of that revolt was not to get oneself lost, because there was an infinite number of possibilities, and one could get lost in that infinite number of possibilities. So luckily there were leaders, there were people who had a vision, and they took over those movements, and they led those movements and made it possible for the movements to stick to their purpose and to their ideals. And of course, the social networks can help in that. We were talking about that today. A lot of artists can now put on live performances without being represented by a producer. And artists today are putting on live performances without going through the normal people, and they can book halls and generate audiences. So that also is a kind of counterculture.
Would you use another word to qualify and to describe counterculture? You used the word resistance. Are there any other words you might just think of to describe it? Answer, yes, counterpower. I mean, a power opposing the main power, because I think that it is all about rejecting a norm that is imposed upon to us. So, but the word resistance, I believe, to enter into resistance is probably the best way to describe it. Pascal, can you think of another word to describe it? Well, it's Rambolian, I would say, because I've just read a play about Rimbaud, so I suppose you could describe it as a heritage of Rimbaud. James Davis, you're one of the programmers, one of the main programmers of the Google Cultural Institute. You are program manager. So is one of the purposes of the Institute and of Google Art Project to create a counterculture within Google, would you say?
Thank you very much for that question, that kind of introduction. It's rather tricky, because I don't think that's the case at all. What we're doing really is a sign of the maturation, in a way, of Google and of Google's mission about organizing information. As you may know, I used to work at the Tate in London, so I come from the cultural sector. And now
you
spent 7 years at the Tate, didn't you?
That's right. And at that time I was engaged in what we think of as traditional forms of curation. In fact, specifically, I worked in interpretation, which is really a kind of bridge between traditional curation. So it's like between what curators and scholars think and what the sort of public wants. So Tate, in some ways, was very innovative and dynamic in actually having this role of interpretation, in being able to build a bridge. And at Tate, I began to work with Google on the beginnings of this project. And what impressed me about working with them before I joined was how open they were to kind of to the new ideas and the new thinking, because they recognized that Google is a technology company and it wants to apply this amazing technology in a brand new space, which was new at the time for Google. And so, of course, it needs external expertise from people who work at museums and cultural organizations to find out kind of the best way to do that. And it's very impressive for me while I was at Tate to kind of work directly with the people at Google on answering these questions. To cut a long story short, now I work for Google on exactly the same project, but the kind of, you know, my head and my heart are in exactly the same place. And that's true for us in this project, where really we're trying to kind of use technology in a new way with culture to kind of find out what the next step is. I kind of look at it as a next step in what curation is, really.
Yes.
So there is, and the way I think of it, that there is a traditional form of curation that we know and understand. It's about going to an exhibition in a museum. It's quite linear in a way. You go on a journey. You recognize the expertise of the curator. Hopefully you enjoy yourself. It's quite often beautiful. It's quite often very high-end. It's very experiential. But one of the influences of technology is that this mode of traditional curation has begun to change into something more interactive. So I think from the mid-1990s onwards, a new kind of curation was enabled through technology, which shifts the power somewhat from an institution to a visitor. It enables the visitor to have more choice about what they do, to go on a curatorial journey, and then to switch and to go on to another curatorial journey. And this might manifest on a website where you can search for what you want. You can have faceted navigation. You can be taken on a kind of curatorial journey and then stop, change tracks, go off somewhere else, pick and choose. And you as a visitor, as a consumer of culture, have more power, and there's more interactivity between you and the curatorial experience. Now, even more recently, and as has been discussed, there's a social form of curation where a dialogue is really beginning to take place. And instead of a kind of, where traditional curation is more about a form of broadcasting, a social curation is really a dialogue between peers, often, between communities, between visitors who are on the same curatorial journey, and often between visitors and institutions or visitors and artists to engage directly in understanding more about artwork and about culture and so forth. So we have a program called Art Talks on the Art Project. So this is a live Google Hangout where you can speak directly with artists, with curators from institutions, ask them questions and so on. And this is a kind of fantastic way to provide a direct channel between you as a consumer of culture and those who curate and create culture. So these changing modes of curation are really what we're kind of learning ourselves on the Art Project and in the Cultural Institute. And we know that technology changes the game. It changes the game in terms of the offering that we can make to people, and it changes the game in terms of the size of the audience, which can dramatically increase, because if you, as a member of an audience, have a far greater choice about how you consume culture, then it's quite simply going to be more appealing to a wider range of people. So at Google, we recognize we have a duty, by having access to such a wide and enormous audience, we have a duty really to figure out what are the best ways to provide cultural experiences to that audience. But we know that we're not curators ourselves, okay? We're a technology company. So what we do is we build a platform that is for curators. So we build professional tools for curators in order to build online exhibits that enable them to kind of reflect what they're doing in their institutions, to take visitors on a journey. That's online. But don't forget, this is new audiences, new visitors.
What are you answering to those who can say, okay,
we know the power of Google, so they were needing a kind of beau geste.
But why would you ask that of an organization like Google? Can you elaborate? Why would you? Can you elaborate on the question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, my question is very simple. You know, for example, in France, Google has something like 95% of market share. So it's something we never saw before. So suddenly, my email address is Gmail. So it's not an ambiguous question, but an objective one, 95% of market share. Sometimes you have to make a beau geste, you have to make something very positive and from intérêt général, general interest.
Well, this is really a kind of, as I say, it's about us growing up as a company. Mm-hmm. It's about continuing to use technology to develop the core mission about organizing information, where previously it began as an algorithm-directed organization with fantastic ways to kind of automate the process of searching and organizing the content on the web. We realize now that there are new ways. So what we're doing is really about turning that automatic understanding into something based on actual knowledge. So moving from data to knowledge. So we have something behind the scenes called the knowledge graph, which is about understanding semantic entities. So instead of just random points in data, it's about knowing what those data points really mean, understanding the different ways that someone like JFK could be described or spelt or understood, and that's a single semantic entity. And then we can do some really kind of smart things in order to cater for the wide variety of ways that people come at that data. So the second part of that is about human intervention. So when we get into art and culture, automated techniques have their limitations as well as their wonderful aspects. You know, it had been discussed about sort of Amazon recommendations and so on earlier. I think these techniques are fantastic in order to take you on a journey, but of course you also need people, you also need experts, you need scholars to be able to help understand and interpret that. And we think that there's room for both. So by building not only the automated algorithmic tools, but tools for scholars and for curators to be able to take us on the journeys based on their knowledge, I think the combination of both is extremely useful, and it's our duty with our amazing technology and with our huge audience to be able to do work exactly like this.
Thank you. Jasmina, you're a very respected plastician, and in your domain, how do you think creation, becoming itinerant in a globalized society, maintains counterculture?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the invitation, and you guys were all amazing, so thank you so much. I wanted to show you a video, yes, to begin with, to contextualize my position and also to kind of create a backdrop for this debate. So this is a work of mine that was produced specifically for the Venice Biennial for the Slovenian Pavilion this year. And the title of the project was For Our Economy and Culture. So I thought it's quite a nice paradigm to show it here. Now, just to quickly, I want to get to countercultures by looking at contemporary art. And basically what we find today is that contemporary art is seen as this enfant terrible of not only culture, but of arts in general. So when I was doing a bit of research on this theme, generally, it really astounded me that basically it's not so much of a problem that contemporary art is loathed or not understood, misunderstood, but the problem is that a lot of spectators, when they go to see exhibitions, they feel fooled. They basically feel fooled by the promise of the exceptionality of art, by its difference. And this is where counterculture should lie, in precisely producing this difference by being other. So basically, contemporary art has, ever since the advent of modernity, really been involved in criticism or rejection of the powerful institutions of its time. Now, sometimes accompanying hope for a better life or a new society. It also never looked favorably on party politics or authority, whilst may or may not being explicitly political. Now, this is actually a quote on a definition on what counterculture is, quoting quite seminal books. So I started thinking about when was the last, or was there ever a time when contemporary art was seen as counterculture realized? Because we're always speaking of music, you know, the 60s, etc. And you like them or not, but, you know, the YBAs in Britain in the 90s, they were sort of the closest we kind of came to this, you know, this paradox of what happens when counterculture becomes realized. So when it enters the press, when it enters the media, when it enters populist culture, basically they saturated the whole field from being just that sort of underdog of the system, if you want. So if we look at contemporary artists of today, the phrases are very far from rock and roll, the sort of terminology that one could use to describe contemporary art today. And the two most kind of common words, if you want, recently are precarity and patience. Now, none of these words are particularly sexy or rock and roll, and like surely they do not hold promise for a revolution. So, of course, you know, we're speaking of a new totality. So I basically want to be looking at what is happening with this new totality and what are the parameters. Now, the general opinion, this is what has been discussed here a lot as well, is that we are looking at this polarization of art. So on one hand, that we have this art that is favored by the private sector, which is many times considered to be politically benign. Populist art, which is deemed irrelevant within this discourse. And then there's this category of art used as a tool for social and political action. But this is a bit of a dangerous territory, because when art is ascribed a function other than being art, it ends up serving somebody's politics. So it's instrumentalized. So where the challenge lives, and in my opinion, the seeds for a new criticality of both the artist and the systems behind them, is actually toward the current condition of reality, which is actually quite complex. Basically, the art system itself, or even worse, the art market, is creating this new field of criticality. Now, we can look at art fairs. They're actually staging artist talks, debates, and so on, because institutions are running out of money. They don't have the funding to pull these things off anymore. So we have Freeze or even FIAC. They're doing all the same things. So this is actually quite a sort of a position away, or pulling away of the discourse from the public sector in a way. And also, of course, then the private sector helps to formulate which practices are of value. So it's sort of, it's kind of fueling its own system, really. Now, on the other hand, the challenge I think we will need to tackle or speak about more is this problem of the national funding. So it's the European funds, the national branding, which is basically taking away the political potential of art. Because what is happening is that with their funding, they're basically favoring artworks which are more easily seen as instrumentalized works. So also the artists and the producers are to blame as well. But on one hand, those of us who are not necessarily engaged with the private sector or decide to remain outside of it end up doing a lot of these funding applications, but there's a lot of boxes to tick. Now, a lot of these boxes are actually to do with social change, helping the local community, etc., which is fine, but that is not necessarily the role of art. It can be, but it's not necessary. So this is also why I wanted to show you this piece from the Venice Art Biennial, because in a way the art system and the arena of national politics collide best precisely there. It's not so much that we're talking about different countries in terms of the money put into the pavilions, which is, of course, there's a very big difference there. So just to illustrate, the USA had twice the amount of money Slovenia had for the whole pavilion just for the PR. But the problem is how the retrospect countries recognize art, or how do they read contemporary art, whether they see it only as an instance of soft power, or do they give it a place in the political arena of debate? And also, how knowingly do the artists and curators play with this notion, but at the same time, of course, keeping a personal paradigm of a system and not merely illustrating the context. Now, Victor Bergen once said, really, really lovely statement, that the only imaginable non-political being is a completely self-sufficient hermit. So in that sense, it is true that culture and art are complicit to some extent with the superstructures within which they develop and operate. And all art is tied to power with the umbilical cord made of gold. So contemporary art can come close to counterculture, but only in identifying the new nexuses of power, not giving the answers. So it's about the new systems, the new politics that need questioning. And in terms of the contemporary art today, I believe that we need to be looking at artistic practices which take active part within the discourse of systems of power, national and corporate superstructures, but without abandoning their highly personal approach and not becoming activist.
Thank you, Jasmina. Thank you. Comme je sais que l'heure tourne.
Well, since I know that the time is slipping by, I'm under the watchful eye of our chair here, and I would like, however, to turn to the room and see if there are a couple of questions, especially for our 4 participants on this aspect of counterculture. Based on new tools, and since I don't know, and I guess you can't know if we're at 100th or 1/10th or the 1/3 or half of the revolution of habits and digital possibilities, we can't really draw a whole graph of the whole counterculture, I guess. Any questions? Well, Pierre, it's Laurent Dessau. I listened to all of this very carefully, but frankly, this term of counterculture, isn't this a concept which belongs to a long dead past now, today? And Yasmina,
Can you explain a little more your video?
Okay. Nice one. Yeah, so basically, it was only a part of the exhibit in Venice. And basically what happened was I on purpose wanted to play with these ideas of what is expected from an artist representing the nation and why it's basically impossible. So the video you see is of 2 performers who come from a very experimental theater of Slovenia, who are hanging the government collection of paintings drawn from behind the backs of politicians. So this is actually the only proper government collection that is hanging in offices of politicians and also of the workers in the National Assembly. And we decided to draw out only flowers. So we have these 2 sort of protagonists of the new critical art that are hanging these artworks, and in a way questioning precisely this thing of how ideologies just get re-articulated. Because they're very valuable works. These were Slovenian impressionists, etc. Yeah.
Thank you, Jasmina. La première question de Laurent.
so Laura's first question, who would like to have a go at answering that? Is this an old-fashioned term? Well, I was not unhappy to hear that question asked, because I have to admit that not only do I never think of counterculture, but I never hear anyone talk about it. And for me, it really is a notion, a historic notion, like some forms of historical music. Wow, before it was different, but now I think that, sitting here thinking about this alone in my corner, that there's a story about dominance here. There are dominant art forms and others which are not, or at least dominant expressions and non-dominant expressions. For instance, if we have a quick look at the visual arts, but I'm afraid I'm going to make people scream here. And here, those art forms are really confronted with something very serious. They're never countercultural anymore. People teach them when they're very young to make performances. It's become very fashionable. All you have in contemporary art are people who are very poor, who have nothing at all, to people who are extremely rich. But you have a continuous line from one extremity to the other. And as far as my practice is concerned, it's a bit more exogenous to this discussion, because music has a bit stupidly, I have to say, and I'm the first one to admit that, I fight against the whole expression of contemporary music, and as soon as I can fight against it, I do. I seize every occasion. But since we don't know what music means anymore, we say, well, okay, music of written expression, I write music for symphony orchestras, things like that. But it's clear that we have not managed to communicate with the public as much as the cinema has, which has only a short history, a century, globally speaking. But contemporary art doesn't stop being contemporary. And to me, it's an ideal area for observation because there are magnificent work being done by artists, but they are constantly generating a critical space to interact with the public. And that's something musicians don't know how to do as well, certainly composers. I don't want to go on at overly great length, but it makes me smile to say this to you. It doesn't happen to me so often. But suppose that you have a news program on TV, 2027, and Pascal Duspin. Who would you invite? Well, if he hadn't done something wrong in the 8 days before, it would have been more original, perhaps, to invite Giuseppe. Oh, okay. But I've done that sometimes with journalists, and everybody says, oh, Joyce Starr, or whatever. Vanessa Starady, or... But I end up saying, okay, well, people like me are always being accused of elitism. That hasn't been said here. I said, oh, yes, but you're those people go off in the corner and you do your elite things, and it's not the same, and it's not really so good. You have to be the same for everyone. And I try to make people understand, well, perhaps, but we never tell philosophers they're elitist. It always comes back to people like us. Well, when I said that if we had a room that's called the Salle de Musique Savante, the room of expert music, no, but that doesn't exist. Composers are not at all, wise people or extraordinary. Some of them are as thick as 2 planks. And you'll allow me also perhaps to say that there have been some great musicians who I admire hugely, and there are various forms that one can admire. So this issue of dominance is really about people like us. Mahler, let's think, okay, when he was sick, people published his temperature charts in the Vienna newspapers. And now it's Johnny Hallyday. If he has a backache, well, he'll have half a page in Le Monde. And François Morel's joke, he said in one of his songs, when I heard the word Mahler, it means the president died. That's an untranslatable French play on words. But anyway, Madame Beaubardy would like to ask far. Isn't counterculture what's happening on YouTube one day, and the next day you see masses of people who are saying counterculture is over?
Celui qui vient nous présenter quelque chose.
Someone who tells us that this has never been presented before, and here it is. 2 days later, there are 2 million people who have clicked on it, and it's mainstream.
Yes, I think this alludes to, and actually you stumbled on the answer earlier when you were speaking about slam and the move from counterculture to culture. I think this is true with YouTube. I think this is true with visual art. Basically, there's been a huge acceleration in the path from counterculture to culture, from kind of against power to power, where now it can happen overnight, as you've just described, through communications media. An example in visual art is if you take something like street art, which definitely began as a countercultural movement, then take an institution like Tate Modern in London, which puts on a huge street art exhibition. So now it's totally included. So the countercultural movements do still exist, but the acceleration and the movement from counterculture to culture is now so rapid that we don't recognize and call them countercultural anymore because there's no time to, because it can happen in 24 hours.
I think it's like the tortoise in the hare, It's sort of running very quick.
C'est toujours la question des marges. Oui, c'est toujours la question des marges. Il y a des mouvements qui sont.
It's always about the margin, really. People are outside of a legal system. We're not just talking about art and culture here. Think about women's rights, the rights of LGBT people when they're integrated. Society assimilates them, and that's something we should wish for. It's a complicated subject. And that, I think, is why I prefer this idea, dominant and subdominant. There are cultures which are still dominated by others in a complete confusion, if you will, which has been created by the extraordinary speed, which is much faster than the speed of human understanding. We're talking about nanoseconds now. Yasmina, Marc, Pascal, James, thank you all very much. Laurent Colembani. And before we go on to the next subject and break up for dinner, I would like Serge Chic, who is director of INA Expert, to present to us a tool from one department of INA, which, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Serge, that show how media buzz is born, and you will focus on cultural buzz. Thank you very much. Yes, good afternoon to everyone. I'll do this quite quickly because I think we're more or less out of time. Just to present INA and talk about what it does very rapidly. I think most of you already know that INA is a body that archives audiovisual content that comes from all different sources, television, radio, and from some time now the web. So INA also archives media, web, blogs, and has been doing so for some years. And basically, since we're lucky enough to be able to collect all that content, we should be analyzing it as well. And we are an archival center. We collect things, and we try to collect intelligently. And in order to collect intelligently, we need to analyze the content, and we need to have the tools that will allow us to look through our own sources. And the department I am lucky enough to head has, over and above its main task of conservation, research, training of professionals, experts, counseling, and we also have a musical research group created by Pierre Schaeffer, and we do image research, but also sound research. So we'll start quite simply by saying that we worked in a fairly radical way. Here you have all the different flows that we collect, and if you want more information, we have a stand that is there to answer your question, but you see we have very different and very numerous flows that we collect. And we had quite a radical approach, saying, first of all, we're talking about culture in big audiences, and we have a positive answer. When we have a look at all the news programs, in particular the most widely watched ones, we realize that the main, this is the graph that I wanted to find for you, the subject of culture represents 7.7% of the content of the biggest news broadcasts. And that's in terms of the number of sequences. And in terms of time volume, it's almost 10%. And it's not to professionals like you, I need to say that that's a quite remarkable figure. Now, obviously, we're not necessarily talking about cultural fora that we've been mentioning around this table here, but it's still a quite remarkable figure. And the other thing that's remarkable is that it's often for news programs the possibility to show in what way they're different. We know that when these programs start, news is very structuring. It creates anxiety. Sometimes we live in a very constrained temporal environment. And culture, which is often at the end of the program, allows these programs to contribute some factor of diversity. I think that's a very important first point. We talk about culture in the mainstream media, and even quite a lot, more than about politics. It's just after general interest and international. So it's really a very important heading. What type of culture do we talk about? And here we see that Media talks about media. That's not terribly surprising, I think. It's a form of egocentrism. And other subjects, you see cinema, music, cultural heritage, performances, publishing, even visual arts are all covered. And often things are linked to major events and not events that are not widely discussed in traditional media, but these things are discussed as well. And we have not integrated in the study the whole range of media forms such as news magazines. Here we were talking about news programs, but there are lots of other programs, especially on the radio, that are cultural programs that are outside of the type of program we're talking about here. Another point that seems to me very important to bear in mind is that culture, and this is a wonderful thing about it, the whole year long there are major cultural events, which means that all year long we talk about culture. And here we've chosen some major events that you might be aware of. And from the beginning to the end of the year, be it in winter, spring, summer, or fall, and there's a sort of rhythm you can see here, which allows culture to be very well represented all year long, which is fairly rare because often with current events there are peaks and valleys, a seasonal effect, but here you really do see culture all throughout the year, and that's something which is important in this culture of overabundance that we have. I don't think I'll comment on that. So let's stick to cultural current events. So we're talking about the importance of major cultural events, and the size of the circle corresponds to the extent of media coverage. So without this being very surprising, we see that the Cannes Festival basically is much bigger than anything else, even if we also talk about literature, theater, performances, music, and visual arts as well. So I don't think there is a single sector which can be said to be excluded here from media coverage, be it traditional media or social networks. Another interesting thing is that we, quote-unquote, had fun comparing cultural events to other major events. And we saw, for instance, that the pride of place that's given, for instance, the Cannes Festival to the Tour de France or a major soccer match is not at all shabby. The comparison is quite interesting, and if you compared it with other smaller cultural events and other less important athletic events, you would probably arrive at more or less the same conclusion. Here is another tool that we have developed that allows us to see the role of the image. We see that text and sound are important means of communication. When you look at the broadcasting of images from Cannes in all its forms, you see that it's very widespread. These are some of the images that circulate the most. If you look at all of the different ones that are present in the media, and you see either it is taken up as such or it's a smaller part of a bigger image. And here, famous people, you have a bit the same thing. And the size of the circle, or the size of the TED inside the circle, represents their media coverage. And we've made some comparisons with other sectors, and here you see that the whole year long, for different reasons, Gérard Depardieu, that was at the time of that whole widely discussed affair in France, and which is at the time he was traded to another team. And you see that these are circles that contain a lot of famous people from culture. We're not talking about emerging stars. We're talking about well-known people. And it's a fairly homogeneous representation. But you see, either because we're talking about politicians who talk about culture or creators who are in the news, that they are very well represented in this universe. And then we took 3 different buzzes. I'll talk to you about them to show you that when there is buzz via media culture, there are different sorts of buzz. The first one we called the Maraval Buzz, you might remember that. That was something published in Le Monde saying that French actors make too much money. And this made a lot of noise because we're at the beginning of a very complicated collective bargaining for the cinema. And what we saw here was that arguments about online arguments concerning the cinema seemed omnipresent, and the people on TV got there a bit later. And this is what you see here. Social networks often pick up on things that are in the written press, and this happens before traditional media forms begin talking about the same things. And this is a buzz that stayed in the news for a long time and sparked off a very structuring cultural discussion. Another type of buzz, which is very different, if we can get that, we called it the origin of the world buzz. We're in a cultural group here, and as you know, Paris Match had thought that this famous picture about the history of painting that represents a dead body basically had found its head. And this was a buzz that was like a gunshot because all the media talked about it at the same time, and quite a lot. And this news was then shown not to be a fake by art critics. It stopped also rather rapidly. But that's a second form of buzz. You have something which is both violent in being very widespread, but also brief because it only exists for a short time. Then a third form of buzz that allows us to put things into perspective when we talk about the role of social networks and the web. And that was the Gangnam Style buzz, which was basically a social network phenomenon. I don't need to tell you more about that. But what was interesting was the way the media covered this. One press agency, AFP, played a very important role in carrying this buzz through its different stages of development. And every time AFP filed the story, we saw that there was a peak in the media coverage corresponding to that particular phase of the story. So there are different sorts of buzz, and here this is not actually a work of abstract art, although it almost is. And what you see in the upper part here, around Gangnam Style, the content that corresponds to stories filed by AFP. And you see that there is a very important traditional source of information, like a press agency, which has a basic role to play when a buzz, even if it's linked to social networks, is transmitted. And traditional media sources go on having quite a lot of power in that respect. And I'll conclude here because we're running out of time. And here, once again, we had lots of fun doing this, as you can see throughout this study. Let's have a look at big French music festivals, and let's compare media coverage of these to the number of people who go to them. And here you have media coverage. You can see the Francophilies are way ahead. And the Printemps de Bourges does pretty well also. And if you compare it with the number of people who go to them, you see there are great big differences. So the media are not the only ones who play a role in getting people to go to events. So very rapidly, the conclusions, very rapidly. First one is that culture has a more important role in media than its economic weight. We talked about the budget and said that it was at a very low level, but it's almost 10% of the media content of major programs. On the other hand, we do talk about it very little in economic terms. And to link back to the discussion that we've been having here, culture is important because it's political, because it's expressed by big politicians who finance it regionally. But when we have correlations between the terms culture, budget, finance, employment, and we know that it plays an important role, but we find very little correlation, which means that we were not even able to show it to you in this study today. So when we talk about culture in economic terms, we need everyone to do the same, over and above the artistic aspects. Thank you very much, Hershey. Thank you, Ina. That was really very interesting indeed, as we thought it would be. And I think we can say that these issues of places where culture and counterculture are born and how long they last, You said yourself, Serge, are very linked to models of financing culture and new ways of financing culture. And it's tomorrow, Nicolas, that our discussions will talk about the new black gold of the 21st century, personal data of a cultural nature. And it's true that counterculture can represent resistance, and it can also be effrontery. And I will cite the term Michel Athanasius, who says that culture has to fight. Thank you very much.
Alors, pour ceux qui sont courageux, ils devraient déjà être dans le car qui les emmène à l'université.
And there will be buses taking you to the university for those who need them. We're a bit behind schedule. For those who are less brave, I would remind you that at 8:10 p.m., the facade of the Palais des Papes will be illuminated and that you are expected at dinner here at 8:30. Enjoy your time at the university, and everyone else have a nice nap. And thanks to all of the participants, and I'm sorry if we had to rush you along, but we are just having a very difficult time with our schedule here.
Like a dog gets me down on my knees.